Most airline clubs are about status, points, lounges, priority boarding. This one was different. It wasn't printed on a card or listed on any airline website. It lived in jokes, in hangar talk, in quiet bragging about how high you'd managed to take the jet. On an ordinary Wednesday night in 2004, two Pinnacle Airlines pilots set out to join that secret club. Their flight, Pinnacle Airlines 3701, had no passengers and no cabin crew. It was just a simple repositioning leg, Little Rock to Minneapolis. The kind of trip that usually disappears straight into the logbook. Instead, they pushed their CRJ all the way to 41,000 feet, the absolute limit. Because, as the captain cheerfully told air traffic control, they had decided to, quote, have a little fun and come on up here. As the jet leveled off, the air grew thin and the margin for error vanished. Airspeed began to bleed away. Warnings lit up. The stick shaker rattled, a hard, physical reminder that the airplane was running out of lift. The jet tried to push its nose down to survive. The crew kept pulling, stretching this climb for just a few seconds more. Within minutes, both engines would quit, and Pinnacle 3701 would be gliding, powerless, toward the lights of Jefferson City, Missouri. What started as a little fun, an unofficial entry into a secret pilot club, became one of the clearest examples in aviation history of how thrill-seeking at 41,000 feet can leave no way back. To understand how this happened, we have to start with the two people in those front seats. The captain was 31 years old. He held an airline transport pilot license with about 6,900 hours of total flight time, more than 5,000 of those as pilot in command. He had around 900 hours flying the CRJ-200 and had been with Pinnacle for several years. By any normal measure, he wasn't a rookie. Beside him sat a 23-year-old first officer, just over 760 hours total flight time, around 200 hours on this specific aircraft. He was new to airline flying, still building experience, and flying with a captain who was older, more experienced, and very sure of himself. That difference in seniority mattered. It shaped who set the tone in that cockpit and who felt comfortable enough to push back. The cockpit voice recorder later revealed casual joking, light banter, and a general sense that this flight was somehow less serious because there were no passengers on board. Investigators described their overall attitude as unprofessional and inconsistent with the discipline expected in airline operations. That mindset is the backdrop for every decision that follows. Inside Pinnacle, there was a bit of lore. Pilots called it the 410 Club. Pilots who had taken the CRJ-200 all the way up to flight level 410, 41,000 feet, would mention it in conversation. Nothing written anywhere official, but investigators later heard testimony that this informal club really did exist, and that some pilots saw reaching that altitude as a mark of skill, or guts. Management, crucially, had no idea just how real that culture was, until after the crash. The CRJ-200 was certified to fly at 41,000 feet, but only under very specific conditions and climb profiles. At that altitude, the margin between stall speed and maximum operating speed narrows dramatically. Investigators found that the climbs pilots used to join the 410 Club often pushed those margins to the edge, choosing aggressive vertical speed climbs that traded away airspeed for altitude. Seen in that light, the decision on Flight 3701 to come on up here wasn't spontaneous at all. It was the logical next step in a culture where an empty cabin meant an open invitation to play at the top of the envelope. That culture didn't start with this crew, but this is where it ended. Pinnacle 3701 departed Little Rock at around 21 minutes past 9 in the evening, local time. The filed cruise altitude was 33,000 feet, but once airborne, the crew started asking for more. First 36,000 feet, then higher, using a vertical speed mode that drove the airplane upward at a rate steadily bleeding off airspeed. By the time they approached 41,000 feet, the CRJ's indicated airspeed had dropped from about 203 knots at 37,000 feet to roughly 163 knots at 41,000 feet, dangerously close to a stall in that thin air. Investigators concluded that the pilot's use of automation showed they simply did not understand how airspeed affects performance at high altitude. From the outside, this just looked like a regional jet flying high. From the inside, small details were starting to line up. Low airspeed, high pitch, engines working right at their limits. Neither pilot called a stop to the climb. No one said, "This is enough." They leveled off at 41,000 feet, right at the edge. The airplane responded with the only language it has: data and warnings. The stick shaker activated as the angle of attack approached a stall. The stick pusher briefly forced the nose down, trying to protect the wing. Each time, the crew fought back against the system, pulling the nose back up, trying to hold their altitude, trying to preserve their spot in that secret club. Aerodynamics don't negotiate. As the stall deepened, the airflow into the engines broke down. Both engines suffered compressor stalls and then flamed out completely. In an instant, the roar of jet thrust vanished. The cockpit went quiet, except for rushing air and warning chimes. They were now a glider, at 41,000 feet, at night, in the middle of the country. In the initial descent, the crew briefly regained some control. The nose dropped, the airplane picked up speed, and they leveled off around 38,000 feet. This was their window. One last chance to treat this like a textbook dual-engine failure. Pitch for the correct airspeed, attempt a windmill restart at the right engine speed, and commit early to an emergency landing. But investigators found that they never reached the minimum 240 knots needed to spin the engines fast enough for a successful restart. One engine had overheated by roughly 300 degrees Celsius beyond its limits during the climb and stall. It likely suffered internal distortion, what's known as core lock, physically preventing it from spinning back up, even if airflow had returned. The crew made several restart attempts, but none followed the complete checklist. Meanwhile, altitude was ticking away. What started as a daring climb had turned into a slow, irreversible slide toward the ground. Both engines essentially gone, no realistic way to get them back. Only after the situation had fully deteriorated did the crew clearly communicate the severity of the emergency to air traffic control. They reported losing both engines and requested a direct route to any airport. Controllers vectored them toward Jefferson City Memorial Airport in Missouri, the closest suitable runway. On radar, it looked possible. The crew even reported the runway in sight as they descended through the final few thousand feet. But glide performance is unforgiving when you've spent too long flying high and slow. Investigators' reconstruction showed that because the crew hadn't managed their energy earlier, both in the climb and in the descent, the airplane simply didn't have the height left to stretch all the way to the runway. At approximately 13 to 15 minutes past 10 in the evening, local time, about 16 minutes after the initial upset at altitude, Pinnacle 3701 crashed into a residential area, roughly 2 to 2.5 miles south of the airport. The airplane broke apart and caught fire. Both pilots died on impact. Remarkably, no one on the ground was seriously injured, but the houses and the neighborhood around them bore the scars of a jet that had almost made it home. The final investigation report did not pull its punches. Investigators concluded that the probable cause of this accident was the flight crew's unprofessional behavior, their intentional deviation from standard operating procedures, and poor airmanship, all of which led to an in-flight emergency they could not recover from. They linked this directly to inadequate training in high-altitude operations and stall recovery. Several factors contributed: the crew's misuse of automation and an inappropriate climb profile all the way to flight level 410. A failure to follow proper stall recognition and recovery procedures, including overriding the stick pusher. A failure to execute checklist-based dual-engine restart procedures at the correct airspeed. And a failure to promptly plan and prepare for an emergency landing once the engines were lost. The report also pointed to the broader cultural issue, the informal 410 club and the thrill-seeking mindset that drove the decision to climb to 41,000 feet on a routine flight with no passengers on board. This wasn't just a story about two individuals. It was a story about what happens when a workplace quietly tolerates fun experiments with razor-thin margins. So what does Flight 3701 actually teach us beyond the tragedy itself? There are several lessons the industry has taken painfully to heart. First, high altitude is not a playground. At 41,000 feet, the difference between a normal cruise and a stall can be surprisingly small. Investigators emphasize that pilots must understand what's known as the coffin corner of the flight envelope and treat maximum altitude as a hard limit, not a challenge to beat. Second, safety systems are not optional suggestions. The stick shaker and the stick pusher are designed to protect the airplane when humans are too slow or too optimistic. Overriding them turned a recoverable situation into a deep stall and a total engine flameout. Respecting those systems, especially at high altitude, is now a key training point worldwide. Third, engine physics matter. After this accident, many pilots learned the term core lock for the very first time. The idea that an engine can physically seize from thermal stress and never restart changed how crews think about high-altitude stalls and the importance of maintaining minimum speeds for any windmill restart attempt. Finally, culture can kill just as surely as any mechanical failure. An unofficial club, some hangar bravado, the belief that an empty cabin somehow means the rules are softer. All of it fed into the mindset that night. Flight 3701 is now used as a case study in crew resource management classes to show how ego, peer pressure, and misplaced confidence can erode professionalism. In the wake of the crash, Pinnacle Airlines and the wider industry made changes that still echo today. Pinnacle introduced dedicated simulator scenarios based directly on Flight 3701, forcing pilots to experience high-altitude stall behavior, dual-engine flameouts, and emergency descents, all in a controlled environment. They also revisited their altitude policies and training around operations near the very top of the CRJ's flight envelope, emphasizing far more conservative performance margins. Regulators and airlines more broadly sharpened their requirements for training in high-altitude climb techniques, stall recognition and recovery, and dual-engine failures. Simulator training began to include scenarios where protections like the stick pusher activate, and crews are required to respond correctly rather than fight against the system. Perhaps most importantly, Pinnacle 3701 became part of the shared language of aviation safety. It shows up in crew resource management courses, FAA safety seminars, and airline ground schools everywhere. Instructors use it to open frank conversations about joking around in the cockpit, about challenging bad ideas even when they come from the captain, and about the responsibility every pilot carries, even when every single seat behind them is empty. Every time a crew levels off below maximum altitude instead of seeing what the jet can do, every time a first officer speaks up about airspeed or margins, A little bit of Flight 3701 is present in that decision. Two pilots went looking for a little fun at 41,000 feet. The industry answered by making sure future crews understand exactly how thin the air really is up there, and how small the gap can be between a quiet joke in the cockpit and a neighborhood lit by burning metal.